The first crack came not from thunder or glass, but from the sound of a child crying alone in a sunlit school hallway while adults walked past pretending not to see. Armin froze mid-step, the custody papers still folded in his jacket pocket, his chest tightening as the echoes of that cry collided with the memory of his own life falling apart in broad daylight. Armin Khalid was 36, a single father who had learned how grief could hide behind routines. Every morning he packed lunchboxes with cartoon stickers, and every afternoon he waited outside the school gates with the patience of someone who no longer expected miracles. His marriage had ended quietly, not with shouting but with absence, the kind that leaves behind unanswered questions and empty rooms. His son, Xavier, was the only reason Armin still believed in moving forward, even when the weight of doing everything alone pressed against his spine like an invisible burden. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled through tall windows and painted the marble floor gold, Armin was called into the principal's office, not knowing that a single conversation would tilt the direction of his life. At the same time, across the city in a glass-walled corporate tower, Samara Qureshi stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking traffic that never stopped. She was 32, the youngest CEO in her industry, celebrated in business magazines and whispered about in boardrooms. But the headlines never mentioned how success felt hollow when earned with a broken heart. Her ex-fiancé's wedding invitation lay open on her desk, the cream-colored card mocking her with elegance. The ceremony was scheduled for the following afternoon, a daytime event in a heritage estate filled with roses and polished smiles. The man she once planned a life with was marrying someone else, and the world seemed to expect Samara to attend with dignity, grace, and proof that she had not lost. She clenched the invitation until her knuckles turned white, her reflection in the glass revealing a woman who looked powerful but felt painfully small. The shock came when Samara realized she could not walk into that wedding alone. Not because she still loved him, but because she had spent years convincing investors, employees, and even herself that vulnerability was weakness. Showing up alone would feel like admitting failure in a world that only celebrated winners. Her assistant had cancelled last minute, friends were suddenly busy, and pride refused to let her ask anyone who knew the truth. Desperation crept in quietly, and by noon she was standing in the lobby of a modest school building, waiting for a meeting with a parent involved in a charity partnership her company sponsored. Armin noticed her immediately, not because of her tailored beige dress or confident posture, but because her eyes carried the same exhaustion he saw in his own reflection at night. She looked out of place among children's drawings and faded notice boards, like someone who had wandered into the wrong chapter of a book. Their meeting was supposed to be brief and professional, but something shifted when Samara's composure cracked under the fluorescent lights. Words spilled out in a rush she had not planned, the truth tumbling over itself. She explained her situation without looking at him directly, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly, asking him to pretend to be her boyfriend for one day at her ex's wedding. Armin felt the absurdity first, a hollow laugh threatening to escape. He was a single dad who barely survived grocery bills and school meetings, being asked to step into a stranger's emotional battlefield. But as he looked at Samara's face, saw the flicker of fear behind her controlled expression, something inside him softened. He understood what it meant to stand in a room full of people who believed you were fine while your heart screamed otherwise. He thought of Xavier waiting at home, of how courage sometimes meant doing uncomfortable things for reasons that couldn't be explained on paper. The daylight streaming through the hallway windows seemed to pause, as if the world itself was waiting for his answer. If you are watching Ripple of Love and you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, this is the moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the smallest decisions carry the biggest miracles. The next day arrived dressed in sunlight and nerves. The wedding venue was a restored colonial estate surrounded by manicured lawns and blooming flowers that looked almost too perfect to be real. Armin stood beside Samara at the entrance, adjusting a borrowed suit that felt tighter than his comfort zone. He had barely slept, haunted by doubts about whether he belonged there at all. Samara, on the other hand, wore a calm smile practiced through years of board meetings, though inside her chest everything felt fragile. As they walked together into the courtyard, eyes followed them, curiosity and judgment blending into a low hum that filled the warm air. Every step felt like walking through memory for Samara. The arches, the music drifting softly, the familiar faces of people who once congratulated her on an engagement that never survived. Armin stayed close, not touching but present, grounding her with his steady pace. He noticed how her breath changed when they passed the altar, how her shoulders tensed, and without thinking, he slowed just enough to match her rhythm. In that small, unspoken gesture, Samara felt something unexpected: safety. The ceremony unfolded under a bright sky, laughter and applause echoing across the lawn. Samara watched her ex exchange vows with someone else, not with jealousy, but with a strange sense of release. The wound still ached, but it no longer bled. Armin stood beside her, observing quietly, his thoughts drifting to how life rewrote itself when you least expected it. He imagined Xavier running across grass like this, imagined a future that did not feel so empty. The day tested both of them, forcing buried emotions to surface, but it also offered something neither had anticipated. During the reception, conversations swirled around them, polite questions and forced smiles. Samara answered with confidence, her role convincing enough to satisfy even the most curious guests. Yet beneath the performance, she found herself noticing Armin's kindness, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his eyes softened whenever children ran past. Armin, in turn, saw beyond Samara's polished exterior, glimpsing the lonely nights and sacrifices that came with her success. They were strangers playing a part, yet something real was growing in the quiet spaces between glances. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the lawn, Samara felt the weight she had carried for years start to lift. The wedding that once symbolized her failure now felt like a turning point. She realized she did not need to prove anything to anyone standing there. Armin felt it too, a subtle shift, as if the universe had nudged him gently toward a door he never knew existed. When the event ended and guests began to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye, only a shared understanding that something meaningful had happened. On the drive back through sunlit streets, silence filled the car, not awkward but thoughtful. Samara stared out the window, reflecting on how a single day had unraveled her carefully built walls. Armin thought about Xavier, about what it would mean to let someone new into their small, fragile world. Life had tested them both, broken them in different ways, and yet here they were, still standing, still capable of hope. If this story has touched your heart so far, please support Ripple of Love by liking, sharing, and subscribing, because stories like this live through your belief. Before the final moments unfold, take a second to comment what this journey made you feel, because your words keep these stories alive. The closing moments came quietly, without grand declarations or promises. Weeks later, in another ordinary afternoon filled with sunlight, Armin watched Samara sit on a park bench with Xavier, her laughter blending with his son's as if it belonged there. There was no pretending anymore, no titles or expectations, just two wounded souls choosing honesty over fear. Samara learned that strength did not come from standing alone, and Armin discovered that love did not always arrive loudly, sometimes it whispered its way into your life through a single brave choice. As the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in soft gold, they sat together, not as a CEO and a single dad, not as a fake couple, but as two people who had found healing in each other's presence. And in that quiet, glowing moment, life finally felt generous again, leaving the audience with a reminder that even the most broken paths can lead to something beautifully whole. The days that followed unfolded gently, like sunlight learning how to enter a room without asking permission. Nothing dramatic happened at first, and that was precisely what made it terrifying for both of them. Life returned to its routines, but the memory of that wedding afternoon lingered like a quiet hum beneath everything else, impossible to ignore. Armin returned to his familiar schedule of school drop-offs, packed lunches, and late evenings spent reviewing bills at the kitchen table. Yet something had shifted inside him. He found himself noticing colors more vividly during daytime walks with Xavier, the way the sky seemed wider, the way strangers' faces no longer blurred together. He caught himself smiling for no reason while waiting at traffic lights, then immediately feeling guilty, as if happiness were something he had not yet earned. Years of emotional survival had taught him to expect loss, not calm. Peace felt suspicious, like borrowed time. Samara, meanwhile, sat through board meetings bathed in natural light pouring through glass walls, listening to discussions about expansion and profits while her thoughts wandered elsewhere. She was still the decisive CEO everyone admired, but now, between sentences and spreadsheets, she felt something unfamiliar tugging at her chest. Not longing exactly, but curiosity. The kind that made her wonder how a man who struggled so quietly could carry so much warmth without it spilling into resentment. She had built an empire by controlling outcomes, yet the most meaningful thing she felt in years had come from an unplanned request and a stranger's yes. Their messages began cautiously. Simple check-ins. Neutral words. Safe distance. But subtext lived in every pause between replies. Armin typed and erased sentences, afraid of crossing invisible boundaries. Samara reread his messages more than she cared to admit, surprised by how grounded they made her feel. Neither of them wanted to name what was forming, because naming things had a way of breaking them. One afternoon, under a pale blue sky, Samara visited Armin's neighborhood for the first time. The buildings were modest, the streets lined with trees that had seen better years, and children rode bicycles without supervision, their laughter echoing freely. This world was far removed from polished boardrooms and valet parking. She felt exposed there, not because anyone recognized her, but because no one cared who she was. For the first time in a long while, she was just a woman walking in daylight without armor. Armin watched from the window as she approached, his heart beating faster than it ever had in meetings with lawyers or school administrators. Xavier tugged at his sleeve, curious about the visitor. When Samara stepped inside, sunlight followed her, illuminating dust particles in the air like tiny stars. She knelt to greet Xavier at eye level, her smile unforced, her presence respectful. Armin felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of gratitude and fear. Letting someone into his son's world was not a small thing. It was a risk he had sworn never to take lightly. They spent the afternoon together at a nearby park, the kind filled with chipped paint and stubborn grass that refused to grow evenly. Xavier ran freely, inventing games, while Armin and Samara sat on a bench warmed by the sun. Conversation flowed slowly at first, then more easily. They spoke of ordinary things, work stress, favorite childhood foods, small failures that still stung. Beneath every word lived the unspoken truth that both of them were still healing, still learning how to exist without bracing for impact. But life, as always, tested them. A sudden complication arose when Armin received notice that Xavier's mother was petitioning for increased custody. The letter arrived on a bright afternoon, its legal language cold and precise, shattering the fragile calm he had begun to trust. Fear returned instantly, sharp and familiar. He withdrew, not intentionally cruel, but instinctively protective. The walls he had built years ago rose again without asking permission. Samara sensed the distance before he explained it. She recognized the pattern, she had lived it herself, pushing people away whenever vulnerability threatened control. Yet this time, she did not retreat. She gave him space without disappearing, offering quiet support instead of solutions. It was harder than any hostile boardroom negotiation she had ever faced. Caring without controlling felt like learning to breathe differently. Armin struggled through weeks of stress, court appointments, and sleepless nights. He felt himself unravel, snapping at small inconveniences, questioning whether he deserved any kind of happiness at all. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult meeting, he sat alone on a park bench, sunlight mocking his exhaustion. Samara found him there by chance, or perhaps by intuition. She sat beside him without speaking, letting silence do the work words could not. In that moment, Armin finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet honesty that scared him more than tears ever could. He admitted his fear of failing his son, of repeating past mistakes, of losing the one thing that gave his life meaning. Samara listened, her own eyes reflecting understanding born from different battles but similar wounds. She did not promise outcomes or offer false reassurance. She simply stayed. That was when something changed irrevocably. Armin realized that love did not demand perfection, only presence. Samara understood that strength did not diminish when shared, it multiplied. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through endurance, through choosing each other on days when it was easier not to. The custody issue eventually resolved in Armin's favor, not because life suddenly became fair, but because perseverance sometimes meets mercy. The relief did not come with celebration, only with a long exhale that seemed to empty years of tension from his body. Samara was there afterward, standing beside him in the courthouse steps under the open sky, their shoulders brushing, the future uncertain but no longer frightening. Months passed. Daylight scenes layered into memories, shared breakfasts, walks through sunlit streets, quiet afternoons spent reading while Xavier played nearby. Samara learned how to slow down. Armin learned how to hope without apology. Neither of them changed who they were, they simply allowed someone else to witness it. In the end, there was no dramatic declaration, no cinematic kiss under fireworks. There was only a moment one ordinary afternoon when Samara looked around Armin's small living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, Xavier laughing softly in the next room, and realized she was home in a way she had never been before. Armin felt it too, standing beside her, understanding that love had not arrived to rescue them, but to walk with them. And so their story did not end with certainty, but with courage. With two people choosing to build something honest out of broken pieces. With the quiet, powerful truth that sometimes the bravest love stories begin not with romance, but with survival, and continue not because they are easy, but because they are real.